Margaret Chen had a talent for looking fine, not the kind of fine that comes from rest or ease, but the kind that earns approval, the kind people admire from a distance. When others looked at her, they saw competence, generosity, strength. What they didn't see was the tightness that lived quietly in her chest, the kind that didn't go away, no matter how busy she stayed. That Tuesday evening, Margaret sat in a folding chair at the Riverside Community Center. The lights were slightly too bright. The coffee was slightly too weak. The cookies on the table were the kind everyone pretended not to eat. She hadn't planned to come. She rarely planned anything, just for herself anymore. But 3 nights earlier, something had happened. Her daughter Emily had come for dinner. They'd eaten quietly. Chicken rice, small talk about weather and traffic. Then, as Emily was leaving, she'd stopped in the doorway. She'd turned around, with an expression Margaret couldn't quite read. "Mom," Emily had said, "can I ask you something?" "Of course, sweetheart." Emily had hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "You're always doing something. Your calendar is packed. You're on 4 committees. You volunteer every day. But," she'd paused, "you don't seem alive." Margaret had laughed, because that's what she did when something came too close. "Of course I'm alive, honey. I'm busier than I've ever been." Emily had shaken her head slowly. "That's not what I mean." The door had closed. The house had returned to silence. And those 5 words, "you don't seem alive," had followed Margaret everywhere since. They'd sat beside her at the food bank. They'd echoed during board meetings. They'd whispered to her in the dark, at 3 a.m. when she couldn't sleep, which is how she'd ended up here, in this uncomfortable chair, waiting for a talk she knew nothing about. The speaker walked onto the small stage, without fanfare. His name, according to the handout, was Graham Hale. He looked to be in his early 70s. Gray hair, gentle eyes, comfortable shoes. He didn't try to command the room. He didn't project urgency or excitement. He simply looked around slowly, as if he recognized something familiar in the faces before him. "I'm going to ask a question." "That sounds rude," he said. His voice was quiet but clear, "but I promise you it's kind." He paused long enough for people to shift in their seats. "How many of you," he continued, "are a little bit tired of being good?" The room went quiet, in a way that felt honest, not awkward, not confused, just still. Margaret felt something crack open in her chest. After a long moment, a man in a thick cardigan stood up. He was the sort of man people trusted without thinking about it. Silver-haired, steady hands, kind face. The kind who always showed up early and stayed late. "I volunteer at the food pantry," he said. His voice shook slightly. 15 years now. "I'm proud of it. I am." He paused. "But lately I wake up dreading it. And then I feel guilty for dreading it. So I keep going. I do everything I'm supposed to do. But His voice dropped to almost a whisper. "I'm so tired." Several people nodded. Margaret realized she was one of them. Graham nodded too, but not like someone offering pity, like someone who understood from the inside. "Thank you for your honesty," he said. That took courage. He walked to the edge of the small stage and sat down, legs dangling. Suddenly, he seemed less like a lecturer and more like someone sharing something important with friends. "Let me tell you a story," he said, "about someone I knew well, a genuinely good man, and how he nearly lost himself, trying to stay that way." The room leaned forward. His name was David Mercer. David Mercer's wife had been the kind of person who made rooms feel warmer just by entering them. Her name was Sarah. She laughed easily. She noticed small things. The way light hit a window. The way a song made someone's face change. She had a gift for making ordinary moments feel significant. When Sarah died, Suddenly, shockingly, from an aneurysm, on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon, David felt like the world had stopped making sense. The funeral was well attended. People said kind things. They brought casseroles. They told David to call if he needed anything. Then slowly, they returned to their lives. The casseroles ran out. The phone calls became less frequent, and David was left alone in a house that echoed. He tried sitting still. He tried reading. He tried watching television. But stillness felt dangerous. In stillness, he could feel the enormity of what he'd lost. In stillness, the questions came. What now? What's the point? How do I fill all these hours that used to be ours? So David made a decision, though he didn't realize he was making it. He decided that stillness was the enemy, that idleness was dangerous, that the way forward was to stay useful. He started volunteering, first at the food pantry, then at the hospital welcome desk, then at community cleanup events. When someone needed help organizing a fundraiser, David said yes. When the library needed evening coverage, David signed up. When the neighborhood association needed someone to coordinate the block party, David volunteered. People noticed. They called him inspiring. They said things like, "I don't know how you do it," and "The community wouldn't function without people like you," and "You're amazing." David smiled and said, "It's nothing." But it wasn't nothing. When David went home each night, the house didn't greet him. It echoed. The silence was thick, so he stayed out longer. He took extra shifts. He said yes, before anyone could finish asking. Being needed felt safer than being alone with his thoughts. Months turned into a year, then 2 years. David's calendar had no white space. Every day was accounted for. Every hour had a purpose. People admired his energy, his dedication, his unwavering commitment to the community. What they didn't see was the tightness in David's chest, the way his hands sometimes shook from exhaustion, the way he'd sit in his car after a shift and feel nothing, not satisfaction, not purpose, just a bone-deep weariness that sleep didn't fix. One evening, after a particularly long volunteer shift at the hospital, David sat in his car in the parking lot. His hands stayed on the steering wheel. The dashboard lights glowed softly. The radio was off. Outside, the world moved on. People coming and going, cars starting and stopping, life continuing as it always did. And in a voice so quiet, it surprised even him, David said, "I can't do this anymore." He sat there for a long time, engine off, lights dimming. He didn't know what he meant by that. He just knew something inside him had cracked. David had a friend named June Calloway. They'd met years ago at a community theater production. June had been the director, a retired drama teacher with a fondness for bright scarves and an uncanny ability to see through people's performances, both on stage and off. After Sarah died, June had checked in regularly, not intrusively, not with pity. She'd simply text, "Coffee Thursday?" or "Saw a terrible movie. Want to hear me complain about it?" David usually said yes, though lately he'd been canceling more often. Too busy, too many commitments. When David missed their standing Thursday coffee for the 3rd week in a row, June didn't assume he was busy. She went looking for him. She found him in his car, in the hospital parking lot, staring at nothing. She tapped on the window. David jumped, then rolled down the window. "June." "Hi." "I was just sitting in the dark looking haunted," June said. "I can see that." She studied his face. "You're carrying bricks again." It was an old reference. Years ago, June had directed a play where an actor had to carry invisible weight across the stage. The actor kept forgetting, walking too lightly. June had put actual bricks in his backpack, during rehearsal. "Now," she'd said, "show me someone carrying something they can't put down." David had laughed at the story when she'd first told it. Now it didn't seem funny. "I'm fine," David said. June smiled, the kind of smile that wasn't fooled. That's what people say, right before they collapse. She opened the passenger door and got in. They sat together in silence for a while. Finally, June spoke. "Do you remember what you said to me at Sarah's funeral?" David shook his head. "You said, 'I don't know how to be a person without her.'" June turned to look at him. "And I see now what you decided. You decided to become useful instead, to become necessary, to become busy." She paused. "But David, you can't outrun grief by scheduling every hour." "I'm not trying to outrun anything," David said, but his voice cracked. "Then what are you doing?" David was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was small. "If I stop, if I'm not useful, then who am I?" June reached over and squeezed his hand. "Come have tea with me." They sat in June's kitchen with mugs of chamomile tea. The house smelled like old books and lavender. A cat dozed on the windowsill. It was the kind of space that felt like it had absorbed decades of quiet conversations. "I want to propose something," June said, "and I want you to try it for 1 month." David wrapped his hands around the warm mug. "What?" June thought for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "I want you to keep volunteering. Keep doing all the good work you do. But I want you to do it differently." "Differently how?" "I want you to do everything with this attitude. I'm a bit bored, so I might as well help." David stared at her. Then he laughed, a bitter sound. "That's ridiculous. That sounds careless. Disrespectful even. This work matters, June. People depend on these services. I can't just treat it like something you're choosing, rather than something you're required to do. It's not about choice. It's about responsibility." June set down her mug and looked at him steadily. "David, you've turned kindness into a burden. Not for other people, for yourself. You've made helping into a punishment you inflict on yourself daily. That's not, isn't it? When was the last time you did anything joyfully? When was the last time you helped someone and it felt light, easy? When was the last time you said yes because you wanted to, not because you felt you had to?" David opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. He couldn't remember. 1 month, June said gently. "Just try it. What's the worst that could happen?" David thought about it. The phrase felt wrong in his mouth. "I'm a bit bored, so I might as well help." It felt casual, irreverent, like he was diminishing the importance of what he did. But he was also so tired. "Okay," he said finally. 1 month. The next morning, David woke at his usual time, 5:30 a.m. He had a food pantry shift starting at 7. Normally, he'd already be mentally preparing, reviewing what needed to be done, steeling himself for the work ahead. Instead, as he made coffee, he tried the phrase out loud. "I'm a bit bored, so I might as well help." It felt absurd, like he was mocking something sacred. But when he arrived at the pantry and stood outside the building, he tried again, quieter this time, almost as a question. "I'm here anyway. Might as well be useful." Something unexpected happened. His shoulders dropped. He walked inside, and instead of immediately scanning for problems or diving into tasks, he just noticed things. The morning light coming through the front windows, the smell of coffee someone had made, the sound of volunteers chatting quietly as they set up. Tom, the pantry coordinator, waved at him. "Morning, David. You ready for the Tuesday rush?" "Sure," David said. And for the first time in months, he meant it without gritting his teeth. The shift proceeded as usual, sorting donations, organizing shelves, helping families select items. But something felt different. David found himself present, in a way he hadn't been in a long time. He noticed things he'd stopped seeing. The labels on the cans, the colors of the produce, the way a nervous teenager struggled with a box cutter. Instead of rushing past to the next task, David paused. "Hey," he said to the teenager. "Want me to show you an easier way to do that?" The kid looked relieved. "Yeah, please. I keep thinking I'm going to cut myself." David showed him. They laughed about it. It was a small moment, but it felt real. Throughout the morning, David caught himself falling back into old patterns. The urgency, the pressure, the sense that everything depended on him. Each time he'd pause and repeat the phrase, "I'm here anyway. Might as well help." It didn't make the work disappear, but it made it lighter. At the end of his shift, Tom approached him. "Hey, David. I don't know what it is, but you seem different today. Calmer, maybe? It was nice working alongside you." David drove home in silence, thinking about that. He'd done the same work, accomplished the same tasks, but somehow, carrying it differently, had changed everything. The experiment continued. Hospital shifts, fundraising meetings, community events. Each time, David practiced the new approach. "I'm a bit bored, so I might as well help." Sometimes it worked beautifully. He'd find himself smiling at strangers, noticing small joys, feeling present. Other times, the old voice returned, fierce and accusatory. "You're slacking off. This is important work, and you're treating it like a joke. People are counting on you, and you're being casual about it. This is why you're tired, because you're not trying hard enough." The guilt was familiar. It had been his companion for years, long before Sarah died, actually. David had grown up in a household where effort meant suffering. His father had worked 2 jobs and worn his exhaustion like a badge of honor. His mother had sacrificed everything for her children and reminded them of it often. Love in David's family looked like martyrdom. So when David tried to approach his volunteer work lightly, part of him screamed that he was betraying everything he'd been taught about what it meant to be good. One evening, after a particularly guilt-ridden day, David called June. "It's not working," he said. "What's not working?" "This lightness thing. I feel like I'm being lazy, like I'm cheating somehow. Like if it doesn't hurt, it doesn't count." June was quiet for a moment. "David, where did you learn that suffering equals love?" The question stopped him cold. "What? When did you decide that the only way to prove you care is to destroy yourself in the process?" David sat down heavily. I don't know. It's just how things are done." "Is it? Or is that just what you were taught?" David thought about his father, coming home exhausted every night, too tired to play, too depleted to be present. He thought about his mother, constantly busy, constantly stressed, constantly reminding everyone of how much she sacrificed. He thought about how he'd learned, very young, that love looked like tiredness, that goodness looked like burden. "I don't know how to do it differently," David said quietly. "You're already doing it differently," June said. "You're just fighting yourself the entire time." What would happen if you stopped fighting? 3 weeks into the experiment, David broke down. It happened on an ordinary evening. He'd finished a hospital shift, driven home, and was making dinner. Nothing special, just pasta and sauce. He was stirring the pot, and suddenly, without warning, he was crying. Not gentle tears, sobbing. The kind that bends you over, that steals your breath, that comes from somewhere so deep you didn't know it existed. He slid down to the kitchen floor, his back against the cabinets, and let it come. It wasn't about Sarah, though she was part of it. It wasn't about exhaustion, though that was part of it too. It was about something larger, something that had been building for years, maybe decades. David cried for the man he'd been trying so hard to be. The perfect volunteer, the tireless helper, the person who never said no. He cried for all the hours he'd spent running from himself. He cried for the belief that he had to earn his place in the world through usefulness. And underneath all of that, he cried for a simpler truth. I'm so tired. I'm so tired. Eventually, the sobbing subsided. David sat on the kitchen floor, exhausted, empty, but somehow clearer than he'd been in years. He pulled out his phone and texted June, "I think I've been carrying more than volunteer work." She replied immediately, "Yes, you've been carrying the weight of proving you deserve to exist." David stared at those words for a long time. Then he called her. "June," he said, "I don't know who I am if I'm not useful." "I know," she said gently. "Sarah loved me, not because I did things for her, just because, and I didn't know how to let that be enough. Even before she died, I was always trying to prove something. And after she died, it got worse. Because if I stopped being useful, then what was the point of me?" "David," June said carefully, "what if your worth isn't something you have to earn? Then what is it? What if it just is? What if you matter because you're here, not because of what you do?" David sat with that. It felt too simple, too easy. And yet, something about it rang true, in a way that all his striving never had. "I don't know how to believe that," he admitted. "That's okay," June said. "You don't have to believe it yet. Just try living as if it might be true." Something changed after that night. Not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually, like ice melting. David felt something in him loosen. He continued volunteering, but he started making different choices. When the hospital asked him to take on extra shifts, he checked in with himself first. Am I doing this because I want to, or because I'm afraid of what happens if I don't? Sometimes he said yes. Sometimes he said no. Both felt okay. When he felt tired, he went home without apologizing. When he didn't know how to help someone, he said so honestly, instead of pretending. When a task felt too big, he asked for support instead of martyring himself. And something remarkable happened. People didn't need him less. If anything, they seemed to trust him more. One afternoon at the food pantry, a woman came in clearly overwhelmed. Her hands shook as she tried to fill out the intake form. The old David would have efficiently processed her, checked boxes, moved her through the system. This David did something different. He sat down beside her. "Rough day?" he asked gently. She looked up, surprised. Then her eyes filled with tears. "Rough year." David nodded. "Would you like to talk about it? Or would you prefer I just get you what you need quietly?" She chose to talk. David listened, without trying to fix anything. He didn't offer advice, didn't try to cheer her up, just listened. When she finished, she looked lighter. "Thank you," she said. "I didn't realize how much I needed someone to just hear me. I'm glad I could," David said, and he realized he meant it, not in a heavy, burdensome way, but genuinely, lightly. That evening, David sat in his living room, the living room he'd been avoiding for 2 years, and didn't turn on the TV. He just sat. The quiet was still there, but it didn't feel hostile anymore. It felt like space. Space to breathe. Space to be. Space to exist without having to justify his existence. Through action, Sarah's photo sat on the mantel. David looked at it and, for the first time since her death, didn't feel crushing guilt for still being alive. I think I'm learning something, he said to the photo. To her. To himself. I think I'm learning that I don't have to earn the right to take up space the house didn't answer. But somehow, it felt less empty. 6 months into David's journey toward lightness, the community faced a crisis. A severe winter storm hit the area, causing flooding and power outages. Several low-income neighborhoods were hit hardest. The call went out for volunteers, desperately needed immediately. The old David would have been the first to sign up. He would have committed to everything: cleanup, supplies distribution, shelter coordination. He would have worked until he collapsed, seeing his exhaustion as proof of his goodness. This David paused. He felt the familiar pull, the urgency, the sense that if he didn't help, disaster would follow. But underneath that, he felt something else. His body's wisdom. He'd already had a full week. He was already tired. So David made a choice. That would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. He signed up for half-day shifts instead of full days. He partnered with another volunteer so they could support each other. He committed to what he could sustain, not what would destroy him. On the first day of volunteering, David worked steadily, but not frantically. When he encountered a problem, too big for him alone, he asked for help easily. When he got tired, he took a break without guilt. When his shift ended, he went home. Something interesting happened, because David wasn't burning himself out. He had space in his awareness for what actually mattered. He noticed an elderly man, standing alone, looking lost. The old David would have been too focused on physical tasks to see him. This David walked over. "You look like you could use some help." The man's face crumpled with relief. "I can't find my cat. She ran away during the storm. Everyone keeps telling me there are more important things right now. But she's important to you," David said. The man nodded, ashamed. David spent 20 minutes helping him search. They didn't find the cat, but David helped him make signs and left his phone number. 3 days later, the man called. A neighbor had found the cat. The gratitude in his voice made David realize something profound. Presence mattered more than performance. At the end of the week, another volunteer, a woman named Patricia, approached David. "I wanted to thank you," she said. "For what?" "For being calm. So many people here are running around frantically, and it's contagious. But working near you felt grounding, like it was okay to pace myself." David felt something warm spread through his chest. Not pride, something gentler. "I'm glad," he said simply. That night, June called to check in. "How was disaster relief?" "Hard," David said, "but not heavy. There's a difference, isn't there?" "Yes," David said. "There really is." As months turned into a year, David's transformation became visible, not just to himself, but to those around him. At the food pantry, volunteers started coming to him, not just for logistics, but for presence. There was something about the way David moved through the space, unhurried but attentive, helpful but not performative, that made people feel calmer. Tom, the coordinator, pulled him aside one day. "I don't know what happened to you," he said, "but whatever it is, can you bottle it and share it with the rest of us?" David laughed. "I just stopped trying so hard." "It shows," Tom said, "and it's contagious, in a good way." David began to notice something else. His relationships deepened, with his daughter, whom he'd been keeping at arm's length with busyness, with his neighbors, whom he'd been too hurried to really talk to, with June, who became less of a therapist and more of a genuine friend. One evening, David's daughter, Rebecca, came over unannounced. She found him on the porch reading. "Dad?" she said, surprised. You're home. And not doing anything. David smiled. Revolutionary, isn't it? She sat down beside him. They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Then Rebecca spoke. You're different, she said. Since Mom died, you've been absent, even when you were physically there. But now you're actually here. What changed? David thought about how to answer. I stopped trying to earn the right to be alive, he said finally. I stopped using exhaustion as proof that I mattered. Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. Did you really think you had to prove that? Yeah, David said quietly. I did. Dad, Mom loved you because of who you were, not what you did. And so do I. David felt that sentence settle into his bones. He'd heard variations of it before, from June, from friends. But hearing it from his daughter, it landed differently. I'm learning that, David said. Slowly, imperfectly, but I'm learning. They sat together. As the sun set, not talking, not doing, just being. And David realized that this quiet presence, with someone he loved, this was what he'd been running from all along. Because being present meant feeling. And feeling meant acknowledging loss. And acknowledging loss meant admitting that life was fragile and precious, and utterly beyond his control. Busyness had been armor. Usefulness had been distraction. Exhaustion had been proof that he was too tired to feel. But now, finally, David was learning to sit with all of it. The grief, the love, the fear, the uncertainty, not as problems to solve, but as textures of being human. And in that acceptance, he found something he'd been searching for all along. Peace. One spring afternoon, a young man named Marcus showed up at the food pantry looking for volunteer opportunities. He was in his 30s, well-dressed, intense. He filled out the volunteer form with meticulous handwriting. When David interviewed him, Marcus spoke quickly, eagerly. I want to make a real difference, Marcus said. I want to commit fully. I can do whatever you need. Weekends, evenings, whatever. I'm ready to really dedicate myself. David recognized something in Marcus's eyes, the same fervor he'd once carried, the same desperate need to prove something. That's great, David said carefully. But can I ask you something? Why do you want to volunteer? Marcus looked surprised by the question. To help people, of course. To give back. To be useful. Those are good reasons, David said. But why do you need to be useful? Marcus frowned. Isn't that the point? To be helpful? Maybe, David said. Or maybe the point is to be present. To show up. To contribute what you can, without burning yourself up in the process. I don't understand, Marcus said. Shouldn't we give everything we have? David thought about how to explain what he'd learned. Can I tell you a story? David told Marcus his story. Not all of it, but enough. About Sarah's death, about filling every hour, about nearly losing himself, about June's assignment, and the slow, difficult journey toward lightness. Marcus listened, his intensity gradually softening. When David finished, Marcus was quiet for a long time. I lost my job 6 months ago, Marcus finally said. Tech layoff. Since then I've been, I don't know, trying to prove I'm still valuable, that I still matter. Volunteering felt like a way to prove that. I understand that, David said gently. But what if you already matter? What if you don't have to prove anything? Then what do I do? You could try volunteering. With this attitude, I'm here anyway, might as well help. Marcus looked skeptical. That sounds too casual, like it doesn't mean anything. I know, David said. I thought the same thing. But try it, just for a few weeks. See what happens. Marcus agreed. though David could see the doubt in his eyes. Over the following weeks, David watched Marcus struggle with the same things he'd struggled with: the guilt, the sense that lightness meant laziness, the fear that if he wasn't exhausting himself, he wasn't truly committed. But slowly, something shifted. Marcus started smiling more, joking with other volunteers, taking breaks without shame, and his presence at the pantry became genuinely helpful rather than performatively intense. One day, Marcus approached David with a curious expression. "I've been doing the 'I'm bored, so might as well help' thing," he said. "And something weird is happening. I'm actually enjoying this. Like, genuinely. It doesn't feel like a burden anymore. It feels like, I don't know, like a choice I'm making. Because I want to, not because I have to." David smiled. "Welcome to lightness. Is it always this easy?" "No," David said honestly. "Some days the old heaviness comes back. Some days I still feel like I have to prove something. But now I recognize it. I can see the weight before I pick it up. And more often than not, I choose to leave it on the ground." Marcus nodded slowly. "My therapist has been saying similar things about not defining myself by my productivity. I always thought that was California nonsense." He laughed. Maybe she was onto something. "Maybe," David agreed. 2 years after June first gave him the assignment, David found himself back in her kitchen. Same chamomile tea, same cat on the windowsill, but everything felt different. "You know what I realized?" David said. "I spent 2 years after Sarah died trying to become indispensable. I thought if I was needed enough, useful enough, busy enough, then I'd matter. Then I'd have a reason to keep going. And now I see that I was trying to earn something that was never actually in question. I mattered to Sarah, not because I did things for her, but because I existed. And I matter now, not because of what I contribute, but because I'm here." June smiled, her eyes warm. "Took you long enough. I'm a slow learner." "You're a thorough learner," June corrected. "There's a difference." They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Then David asked something he'd been wondering about. "June, why did you help me? Why did you care enough to notice I was drowning and throw me a lifeline?" June considered this. "Because," she said simply, "I saw myself in you. 20 years ago, after my husband died, I did the same thing. Filled every hour. Stayed busy. Pretended I was fine. A friend finally sat me down and said, 'June, you're living like you're being graded. Like life is a performance. And you're terrified of getting a bad review. What did you do?' I collapsed," June said frankly. "Complete breakdown. Had to take a leave from teaching. Spent 3 months barely able to get out of bed." David hadn't known this. "What changed?" "I realized I had a choice. I could keep performing, keep proving, keep exhausting myself, or I could just be, just exist, just take up space without apologizing for it. That simple? That simple. That difficult." June smiled. "So when I saw you heading down the same path, I figured I'd save you the 3-month breakdown, if I could." David laughed. "Thank you. You're welcome. Now, what's next for you?" David thought about it. "I don't know. And for the first time in my life, that feels okay." Back in the community center, Graham's voice softened as he brought the story home. "David didn't become perfect," Graham said. "He still had hard days when the old patterns returned, days when he felt guilty for resting, inadequate for saying no, selfish for having boundaries. But he learned to recognize those feelings as old habits rather than truth. He learned to carry his life lightly, even when the contents were heavy." Graham paused, looking around the room. His eyes found Margaret, And that brings us back to the question I asked at the beginning. How many of you are tired of being good? Margaret realized her cheeks were wet. She hadn't noticed herself crying. Graham continued, "You're not tired of being good. You're tired of carrying goodness, like a burden. You're tired of using exhaustion as proof of worth. You're tired of performing instead of living." The man in the cardigan, who'd spoken at the beginning, stood up again. "So what do we do?" he asked. "How do we change?" Graham smiled. "You've already started by being here, by being honest, by admitting that something isn't working." He stood up and walked to the edge of the stage again. "Here's what I want you to try, just for 1 week. When you do something kind, something helpful, something good, approach it with this attitude. I'm here anyway. Might as well be helpful. Not because you must. Not because you'll be a bad person if you don't. Not because your worth depends on it. But simply because, why not? You're here. You have hands. You have time. You might as well use them lightly. And notice what changes. Not in what you do, but in how you carry it." The room was utterly quiet. "Because here's what David learned," Graham said, "and what June learned before him, and what I learned before that. Lightness isn't about caring less. It's about carrying less. You can love deeply without drowning. You can give generously without disappearing. You can show up fully without burning up completely. The world doesn't need your exhaustion. It needs your presence. And presence requires space. Space requires lightness. Lightness requires permission. So I'm giving you permission," Graham said gently. "Permission to rest. Permission to say no. Permission to exist without justification. Permission to care about things lightly, playfully, joyfully, even when they're serious. You don't have to earn your place here. You don't have to prove your worth. Through suffering, you're allowed to be alive, without it being so heavy." Margaret stood in her kitchen on a Tuesday morning, coffee in hand, looking out the window. 3 months had passed since that evening at the community center. 3 months since she'd heard David's story and felt something crack open in her chest. The changes had been small at first. She'd canceled 1 committee meeting. Just 1. The guilt had been enormous, but the world hadn't ended. The committee had functioned without her. Then she'd said no to organizing the charity gala. Someone else had stepped up. It had gone fine. She'd cut her volunteer hours from 70 a week to 20 and discovered that 20 mindful hours did more good than 70 desperate ones. She'd started taking walks in the evening, not power walks, not exercise walks, just walks, noticing things. The way light hit the trees, the sound of birds, the feeling of moving without purpose. Her daughter had noticed. "Mom," Emily had said last week, "you seem different, lighter somehow." "I'm trying to be," Margaret had said. "It's nice," Emily had replied. "I feel like I can actually reach you now." This morning, Margaret had nowhere to be. Her calendar had white space, actual empty hours. The old Margaret would have panicked and filled them immediately. This Margaret poured another cup of coffee and sat down with a book she'd been meaning to read for 3 years. After a few chapters, her phone rang. The food bank coordinator. "Margaret, I know you've cut back your hours, but we're short-staffed today. Any chance?" The old Margaret would have said yes before the question was finished. This Margaret paused. She checked in with herself. How did she feel? Was she tired? Did she want to go? "Sure," she said. "I can do a few hours this afternoon." "You're a lifesaver." Margaret smiled. "I'm just someone who has a few hours free and figured I might as well help." "Well, we appreciate it." After she hung up, Margaret sat for a moment. noticing something remarkable. She'd said yes, but it felt different. Not heavy, not obligatory. Just a choice. One she was making freely, lightly, without it defining her worth. She finished her coffee, got dressed, and drove to the food bank. When she arrived, she noticed things she'd been too busy to see before. The way afternoon light came through the windows, the laugh of a volunteer she'd worked with a dozen times, but never really talked to, the grateful smile of a mother with two small children. Margaret worked steadily, but not frantically. When she got tired, she took a break. When she didn't know how to help someone, she asked for guidance. When her shift ended, she left. On her way out, the coordinator caught her. "Thanks again for coming in. You were so calm today. Made everything feel easier." Margaret nodded. "I'm glad I could help." And she was, genuinely, lightly, without needing it to mean anything more than exactly what it was. A few hours on a Tuesday afternoon, when she happened to be available and chose to show up. As Margaret drove home, she thought about David from Graham's story. She wondered if he was still out there somewhere, still practicing this art of lightness, still learning day by day how to carry his life without it crushing him. She hoped so. She hoped the same for herself. And as she pulled into her driveway, Margaret noticed something extraordinary. She was smiling, not the tight, performative smile she'd worn for years, but a real one. Soft, easy, light. The kind that comes not from proving anything, but simply from being alive. And for the first time, in longer than she could remember, that felt like enough. In the end, David learned what many of us resist, that we don't have to carry everything we touch, that compassion doesn't require martyrdom, that showing up can be light, even when what we're showing up for is heavy. He learned that, "I'm bored, so I might as well help," isn't disrespectful to the work. It's respectful to himself. It's an acknowledgement that his worth isn't determined by his usefulness, that he can contribute without consuming himself. And perhaps most importantly, he learned that lightness isn't the opposite of depth. It's what makes depth sustainable. We can care deeply without drowning. We can love fully without disappearing. We can show up completely without burning up entirely. The question isn't whether the work matters. The question is, can you let it matter without it defining whether you matter? Can you be helpful without being heavy? Can you be good without it being so hard? Can you carry your life lightly, even when it's filled with serious things? David's story suggests you can. Not perfectly, not without struggle, but genuinely. And maybe that's the most important thing. We can learn that we're allowed to take up space without earning it, allowed to exist without exhausting ourselves in the process, allowed to be alive without it being quite so heavy. Maybe that's the real work. Not doing more, but carrying less. Not being better, but being lighter. Not proving ourselves, but allowing ourselves to simply be here, present, breathing, alive, and to discover that has always been enough.